Hello and welcome to the Shetland Times podcast. Today I am chatting with James John Paton, a Shetlander expat now living in the north of England. If you've got any comments, thoughts on the podcast, please let us know. Also, please feel free to leave us an iTunes review for the Shetland Times podcast. It makes a huge difference to people considering listening. I hope you enjoy my conversation with James Paton. Hello.
Hello, Thor. Yeah, I don't know what's going on there. That's a very poor sound quality at my end. It might be, it's not a cheap laptop. It's a Hewlett-Packard, which is usually pretty good quality. But
It won't be the laptop. Where are you? What location are you in?
I'm in Skipton in North Yorkshire, and the Wi-Fi signal is strong.
Yeah, but Scottish Wi-Fi is better than English Wi-Fi.
Oh, I've absolutely... Well, I don't doubt it for a minute.
Speaking of which, how the heck have you ended up in Yorkshire when you're from God's own country, the Promised Land?
But I ended up in Yorkshire. Now, how did I end up in Yorkshire? Well, I had left Shetland for the second time in 1998. And it would be fair to say I probably was, well, I didn't know at the time, but I wasn't well. I was suffering with depression. Mm-hmm. And I left, not really knowing what was wrong with me. And I ended up staying in St Andrews with a dear old friend who had been something of a mentor to me in Shetland. He worked in the youth service there. So I ended up in St Andrews, and whilst I was there, I met a Yorkshire woman. So that's how I ended up in Yorkshire.
And what was so special about this Yorkshire woman? I do like their accents. A Yorkshire girl, female accent, it can be very alluring, but I'm sure there was more to it than that, James.
Well, we met and married within, 6 months, less in fact. And we're just about to get divorced.
Sorry, I shouldn't laugh quite so heartily. That's a great story.
Well, we've been separated for 3 years now, and that's a whole... Nothing, it would be fair to say, nothing about my life has been simple. And that's one of my quests now, is trying to simplify my life. But, well, it's the age-old story. One falls in love. Love is a many splendid thing, whilst it lasts. So that's how I ended up. Anyway, she was a friend, my friend from Shetland days, who was then living and running his own business in St Andrews as a business consultant. Was doing business with this chap, and he invited his friend up to St Andrews for a weekend, and that's how I met the Yorkshire woman.
I see.
I'll be discreet and not mention her name. But.
Yeah. We don't need to go into that side of it, but that's
no. So that's and basically she was living in Leeds, and I moved down to Leeds. It's as simple as that, really.
So what's your backstory then? You were born in Lerwick?
I was born in Lerwick, 1961, to Joan and Alec Paton. And the first house I remember was at Clickham Road, looking over the Matchbox House and out to Brewick Bay. Mm-hmm. And I was there until I was about 4, and then we moved to Water Lane near the BT repeater station. Mm-hmm. And that's still the family home. Mum and Dad are still living at 14 Water Lane. So that was really where I grew up until the first time I left Shetland was, I'd been on school trips and one time or another, but left Lerwick after doing 6th year to go and study in Aberdeen. And I did 4 years in Aberdeen doing chemistry. And because I was at Robert Gordon's College as it was then, I ended up working in the oil. I did a year out. It was an option they gave you because it was a college, no university. You could go and do this year out in the industry. And I worked for Shell in Aberdeen for a year. And then so when I came home after that, I ended up in the oil industry. I ended up at Sullombo in the lab, mostly, but I did have a short spell as what they call a cargo surveyor on the tankers. And I did that for 5 years. So living in Lerwick, back when we thought you couldn't get a house for love nor money, although strangely I did finally buy a house, and then left a year later in 1988, a year after buying the house. But during that time working in Doyle, I got very involved in youth work. I was on the children's panel and Shetland Association of Youth Clubs, and 60 North in particular, that ran out of the Anderson High School. The lit Beatrice, Arcus, Beatrice Smith, and Betty Clark worked closely with them. And then I got involved in politics and trade unions and stood for the council in 1986. But I only did 2 years of a term, as I say, because I left in 88. Reasons for leaving, I mean, I suppose for expats, I suppose folk are maybe interested why you leave a wonderful place like Shetland. But for me, I really got fed up with the oil industry, and so needed to change vocation and career. And I went to Wat Edinburgh to retrain as a youth and community worker.
So
when I finished, hold
on, James. Yeah. What made you fed up with the oil industry? Because many people think it's a business. Certainly was up until a couple of years ago, flowing with milk, honey, and cash. What was it that this?
Well, it was at the time. I mean, given when the oil started flowing, 78. I mean, in many ways, I wasn't trained to do anything else, and especially having done the year in industry. I mean, I came back for 4 years that I was at college, or 3 of the years I was at college. I worked in the post office alongside my father, and actually, when I came back to Shetland, I probably would have been a lot happier as a postman, to be quite honest. But I think a number of things with the oil industry, working in the lab is very routine work. And I think over the 5 years, the routine of it was a sharp contrast to the kind of interest and exciting work I was doing initially in youth work. And then, of course, when I got nobody was probably more surprised as myself, got elected onto the council in 1986. I was, mine's to say, I was only 25 then, so I was really young. Trying to think. I think Chris Dowell at the time, when he was elected 4 years, I think, before me. He was actually the youngest ever councillor, I think, to get elected. I might be wrong. Slim Jim might have been elected at a younger age, but certainly Chris Dowell, I think, was the youngest ever councillor elected. And then after him, I came along. Chris was still on the council when I was. So I think it was that contrast between very interesting and exciting work in youth work, and then also what I learned through the council, working on council things. I mean, it was a very fascinating time in the 80s, the mid-80s in particular. We were trying to nail one of the things that had been overlooked with the negotiations with the oil industry was the whole rental issue at Sullombo.
Yeah.
That was fascinating, and it was quite interesting being involved in that for the council side, being an employee in the oil industry at the same time. But I must say, I think I got really, really fed up. And that's maybe a lack of resilience on my part with the oil industry. And I must say there was some political motivations as well. I mean, the council's difficulties with the oil industry aside, I was becoming more and more, shall we say, environmentally aware. Mm-hmm. And working in the oil industry, unfortunately, just didn't sit with my environmental beliefs.
So where did that come from? Where did they emerge from?
Well, that's an interesting thing. The final year doing chemistry at Robert Gordon's, I did a module called The Impact of Science and Technology, and that really opened my eyes to sort of emerging still, I suppose, environmental movement. Mm-hmm. And the more I read about it, especially when I got back to Shetland, and I suppose working in the oil industry, and there was, I suppose you see it firsthand when you're working in the oil industry. Of course, there was the whole health and safety issues at the time, maybe less so onshore, although there certainly was a few health and safety issues at Sullombo at the time, as I recall, because they ended up doing a huge anti-corrosion piece of work on the terminal. But, of course, in 1988, there was the Piper Alpha disaster offshore. And I mind, because I was a trade union rep in the industry at the time, just for the lab staff, being interviewed, I think it was by ITV, who were doing a big thing about safety in the oil industry. And I just at that time, put in my tuppence worth. And I think, certainly after that interview, I thought my position in the oil industry was probably untenable. I mean, not that I had a high-powered position, I was just a humble lab technician. But I just felt, I suppose in all conscience, I couldn't continue working in the oil industry, that I was sort of at odds with, both environmentally and broader politically, in terms of what I'd been exposed to, if you like, through the council work and the council negotiations on the rental.
So did you see the next step, and you knew where you were going? Because I think a lot of people, James, might feel that they are not, their values, their personal values don't fit with whatever industry they're in, whether it be for some ethical reason or whatever, but not a lot of people, well, in my experience, feel quite so confident to make the jump. So what was going on there for you?
Well, yeah, I think, well, not just the oil industry, I should say I did have a big fight with the council, and being young and perhaps reckless. I mean, one of the main things for resigning for the council, the main thing was I couldn't, I suppose I could have left the oil industry, carried on as a council, and got other work. That, because, jobs, even new, I think Shetland, relatively still well provided for we work. I came increasingly, folk leaving school and going to university are less likely to be able to get home because of work. But at the time, for me, I probably could have get something, something else was going on. So it's a very difficult now with hindsight even to say what was the I just thought, because my position on the council I felt was untenable, because my position in the oil industry was untenable, I certainly had to go away. I felt I needed to get away. And I suppose, being maybe hard on myself, but nonetheless, I think I suppose I felt I blotted my copybook in terms of a career in the oil industry, and certainly blotted my copybook as a councillor, having only done 2 of the 4 years. I mean, that felt a bit of a betrayal to the folk that kind of put their faith in you and put the X in the box beside your name. I think perhaps expectations of me and my own expectations of myself were, as a councillor, were unrealistic. I mean, I was one of 4 Labour councillors at the time. There was 1 or 2 independents that were sympathetic, but we were very much in the minority compared to sort of Liberals, Tories, and there was still quite a few Shetland movement councillors on the council at that time.
So you're talking politics, and I'm glad you've moved it to politics. I just want to catch you on this one before we go and slip off of politics again, and that is you've lived in Yorkshire for 18 years, and you were part of a movement to get Yorkshire devolution, which I think is fascinating, and I wondered if you could tell me about that, and also about your thoughts on whether that would be a realistic option for Shetland. What do you think of that?
Well, the politics, basically, after leaving Shetland, it's not something that really ever left me. Although I had 2 wild years in Edinburgh as a student, youth and community work, that kind of work was very practically based. You're out in the community, and I was exposed to a lot of issues that simply weren't issues in Shetland. You know, significant poverty, significant drug use. I was based in Leith in Edinburgh, working at a youth club there. And you were certainly exposed to things that you'd been very sheltered for, certainly in the 60s, 70s and early 80s in Shetland. So there was a bit of I delved into some more extreme politics when I was in Edinburgh. I did some leafleting and stuff with both the SW, the Socialist Workers' Party, the Trotskyite organisation, and then did some work with the anti-poll tax movement when it emerged. We used to see quite a bit of Tommy Sheridan, well, for a time was the sort of Scottish Socialist representative before his fall.
Whatever happened to Tommy? Whatever happened to him? Wasn't there some newspaper case to do with swingers or something?
There was, and I couldn't really comment. I mean, I was definitely in England when all that blew up. There was certainly differences within the party exacerbated, but I don't know if he'd been economic with the actuality around his test.
That's a good expression. I've not heard that.
There's no right.
Economic with the actuality. That's brilliant.
The old politician in me coming out.
Yeah.
He was. I think he actually went to prison briefly.
Oh, because he call the newspaper a liar or something, and then took them to court and won money from them,
court.
and then
I think he'd sued one of the newspapers and actually won, but there was something that caught him out, and I think he was done for contempt of court.
Okay,
I think that was it.
Anyway, you had nothing to do with that Swinger case, so we won't mention any more about that.
I should certainly precursor everything I say with allegedly.
Yeah, exactly. Well, so come on then, back to devolution. What was the devolution for Yorkshire?
Devolution.
And would it work in Shetland? Wouldn't it work in Shetland?
When I was in very, very briefly, when I was in Edinburgh, I met a Shetland lass who I didn't ken in Shetland, and she ended up working in Strasbourg in France for the Council of Europe. Mm-hmm. And after I finished studying, I ended up going and being with her, and we married. We married in France, actually, and we were together for 6-7 years. But on return to the UK, one of the things, our marriage unfortunately fell apart, but one of the things that happened was I was asked to stand for Parliament in '97, and I'd no realistic. I didn't think I would get work back in Shetland, but as it turned out, I ended up back in Shetland in '96. Sorry, this is a bit more long-winded, but I stood for Parliament. I spent 2 years working through AB Associates with Andrew Blackadder, largely doing European work as a consultant for the Council. But at the end of that, in '98, I was approached to stand for the European Parliament for Scotland. Yeah. At that time, they brought in PR for the European elections and a list system, rather than the Highlands and Islands as a constituency. The whole of Scotland became a constituency, and you get on a party list. Yeah. And I there were several things going on, quite complicated, but I left Shetland again, and I don't think I was well actually then. I think I was suffering from depression. And that's what I ended up in St Andrews. Anyway, I finally overcame that, and I stood for the European Parliament, silver medalist, a bit like my endeavours as a parliamentary candidate in '97 for Orkney and Shetland. Always the bridesmaid, never the bride. But when I got to Yorkshire, because with the incoming Labour government in '97, devolution for Scotland was a high priority for the lovely Donald Dewar and several other Scottish MPs. And so I got a taste of that, and I tested that campaign before I even moved to Yorkshire. And whilst I got work working in the cultural sector, museums, libraries and archives at a regional level in Yorkshire, I was kind of headhunted and poached to work for a new body that had just been set up called the Yorkshire Humber Assembly. And this was the whole regional move for the then Labour government to following on for devolution for Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland was to the English question really. And so they set up this almost voluntary bodies that were largely bringing other local authorities together under one roof, and then other sectors like business, voluntary sector, environment, etc., and forming this discussion bodies called assemblies. And really, for 2002, it took off. They'd already set up regional development agencies. There was government offices which had already existed in the regions. So there was a real move towards this kind of devolution and regionalisation of power structures across England. It was hugely contested in some bits of England, and some of the boundaries and borders and some of the regions were disputable. But the upshot of that was, I think, by about 2008, forgive my memory, there was a test referendum in the northeast of England. And actually, the folk in the northeast voted no, which was kind of strange and slightly unexpected from my point of view, because when there'd been talk of Scottish devolution in the late 70s, the people in the North East seemed vociferous that if Scotland got its devolution then, that the North East would want some special measures for it as a region. So it was very surprising in 2008 that the North East voted quite overwhelmingly no. I think one of the reasons was that what they were voting for was pig in a poke. I mean, the powers were going to be very, very limited. I mean, nothing on the scale of the Scottish Parliament or even the weaker Welsh Assembly. So, and in a way, they were right to reject it. The problem with the proposals that were really come through the department that John Prescott was running, the office of the Deputy Prime Minister, he was really in charge of the referendum and that. I think he was snookered a bit by officials who had written this draft bill that had formed the basis for the referendum that just wasn't worth the paper it was written on. The other side of that, of course, was at heart neither Blair nor Brown were that enamoured with the idea of Scottish Parliament, never mind devolution in England. I mean, it's just that thing about centralisation of power. Really. And I think because they were so powerful when they got elected, I think they didn't quite realise actually what a mandate they'd received.
Yeah.
I think it took a while to sink in actually.
And then they ran with it.
They ran with it, but it's that thing about power and absolute power corrupting. And whilst I was still in the Labour Party at the time, they did a lot of good things, but they missed an awful lot of opportunities. I think a lot of stalwarts and old-fashioned lefties like me, we can probably pick out more disappointments than achievements for the Blair and Brown era.
So before we
slide down,
go on, James. Sorry.
I was just going to say after that referendum, it was like the whole devolution regional thing reverted back to very much a Whitehall-controlled, devolution. It wasn't so much about powers being taken as powers being given. And so they were just going to rumble on with regional development agencies and kind of regional consultative bodies. But I think because the moment had been lost, the impetus had been lost, particularly for a place like Yorkshire that has a very strong identity and sense of itself. Not to say that Yorkshire was deeply divided about the whole idea, as a lot of people saw, another tier of government. I think that was the biggest obstacle or sense of obstacle was this idea that mere bureaucracy. And also the local authorities weren't particularly happy about a sense that they might have lost power. But the upshot was, of course, when 2010 and the Tories and Liberals came into power, bizarrely for the Liberals as a federal party, they were happy to support the Tories in completely removing that regional tier. Government offices went, regional development agencies went, that whole regional tier that had been built up over the previous 10 years was completely removed under the guise of promising more devolution to local government, which actually never materialised. I think the only thing that really happened was a slackman of planning powers to allow people to put sheds up or extensions.
Well, sheds are important. Let's not devalue sheds.
I mean, the only really thing that I suppose has come out of it in this place was there was a notion of city regions, and I suppose the mere independence that Manchester has got as this kind of city region. And there's still a thing floating around the city region. So the second part of your question about whether it will kind of come back again, I mean, these things are often cyclical. And I think one of the difficulties for me as an old lefty, green lefty living in England is that you kind of see the Tories being in power in perpetuity now.
Isn't that part of Nicola Sturgeon's argument as to why Scotland needs to go independent why there needs to be a second independence referendum. And that was my second part of my question, was really specifically about Shetland and the idea of Shetland getting some kind of deal like the Faroe Islands. No, it's okay. But to me, I think there is real momentum behind a second independence referendum. And just because the numbers don't show that they'd win it at the moment, I don't think that means they wouldn't win it. And I think Nicola Sturgeon might have figured, along with her very smart team, that it's the best chance they're going to get, and that, as you say, there will be a Conservative government pretty much in perpetuity unless Corbyn leaves, which doesn't look very likely in the near term. So I wondered what you think. It's really Shetland I hoped we could focus on, but Scotland and Shetland.
Sure.
What's your thoughts on that?
I would. I've never really been a keen Shetland movementer. My problem with mere devolution to Shetland was really about the sort of the politics and democracy of Shetland. I mean, I always felt, and I suppose it's a bit more the case now, that councillors should be full-time paid and that there should be less of them, but that should have been a full-time paid position in Shetland, particularly because of the issues that Shetland wrestled with, particularly at the time, the oil industry, which it's still dealing with, of course. But certainly the Faroese model, I think, has great appeal. If I was back in Shetland, it would be certainly something I'd be advocating, and something I would strongly advocate in the sense of an independent Scotland, because I think Shetlanders historically and understandably, even going back to the 12th or 13th century, have had a fear of Scotland and Scottish rule. And I think because of its remoteness, I think, and obviously with fruit oil, and that is a finite resource, I certainly think Shetland to have greater determination over its future is a good thing. It does beg the question, though, why we govern. And when you look at debates that have been raging about the oil fund and what I consider certainly to be the democratic deficit around proposals for mayor trustees to be, inverted commas, independent. Bottom line is nobody's blooming independent. Everybody's got an agenda, and especially people who want power and want to exercise power, they always have an agenda. I've from a distance supported the movement to make sure that it's elected people that should be on the board of trustees or the charitable trust. But it's not to say, I mean, I've long maintained there's certainly enough talent and brains and ability in Shetland for it to do an awful lot more for itself. And that's not just from a sort of political running and administration point of view, but I think from a sustainability point of view.
Yes.
And money-wise, Shetland's no hide to do a lot of things that I think it should do because it's been relatively well off. I have no sense of that having changed, but having lived there since 1998, I have no sense that things are a lot tougher, although having followed the Shetland Times, wherever I've lived, my mother's always sent me the Shetland Times, I'm all too aware that the austerity has become an issue in Shetland in terms of budget cuts, and I'm sure it is a very different, and if you're no wheel off and just earning a local wage in a local firm, I'm sure things are a lot harder now than they were in the 80s or 90s.
I'm glad you took an opportunity to mention the Shetland Times there, being as this is the Shetland Times podcast, James, and I didn't even have to ask you to do it, but that was wonderful product placement. It's funny you should say that, though, because I've spoken to a few other Shetlanders for this show who are expats, and they genuinely tell me, whether it's on air or not, that it's pretty much the only newspaper they read, which is great for the Shetland Times, but bad for the newspaper industry, I would say.
Well, I think the thing is, I mean, I do keep in touch through you and other media organs in Shetland, and I think when it first was set up, because it was new as well, the whole idea, the Shetland News as an online facility, bearing in mind I was living abroad and this was the early days of the internet in the 90s. I was in France from 90 to 96. Certainly that was, but having said that, wherever I lived, my mother always sent me the Shetland Times. So I used to get it within days, even living in Strasbourg in France. In fact, here in Skipton, I get it on a Saturday morning.
It's a little corner of Shetland you've created. Did you set up an Up-Helli-A of some kind in Skipton or something?
Oh, that was that's another. I'm afraid nothing with me is very straightforward or simple, Thor.
Well, don't worry, we're nearly out of time. Now, let's just leave that then.
Right, okay, well,
no, I'm joking.
Everybody will be very blind to hear what I need to do. No, I did. I was home for my midda's 80th birthday 2 years ago.
Yeah.
And of course, it was the Up-Helli-A Fire Festival had been, and people were gearing up for the Lerwick Up-Helli-A. And I had a notion to maybe try something down here, because there is a very long tradition, almost unrecognised Viking tradition, even where I am in Skipton in North Yorkshire. And so my brother-in-law very kindly lent me his Viking outfit for several years previously, and I was running a shop at the time, and we just had a very mini Up-Helli-A. I built a galley, and we burned it outside the shop, and we sang the song.
Brilliant.
And then we caroused around one or two of the local bars.
Sounds good to me. I think there should be Up-Helli-As all over the place. I think it's got real promise, reviving a Viking culture across the world.
And in terms of the Shetland Times, again, wherever I've been, I've not been backward and coming forward with the odd epistle. And I think I even did a sounding off column 2 or 3 years ago. So you might want to go through back columns and see the howlery I was spicking down.
That's fantastic. Well, I'm glad to hear you've been raising hell and literally fire raising in Yorkshire.
Well, I mean, on a serious point, certainly politically, I'm very pro-independence and very pro-devolution of power from whatever centre of power, be it national in the UK terms or even within Scotland. I mean, I do like the whole idea of independence because it devolves power. It's just, for me, it's a pity the Scottish National Party wasn't called the Scottish Independence Party. I'm no very strong on nationalism. And it's the same in the Shetland context. The Shetland movement is, I think it was a good idea. It was very poorly executed and no enough thinking had gone into it at the time. It seemed very disjointed and, as I say, strategically not very well thought out. But certainly, but when, I'm hoping it's a when Scotland gets independence, that certainly there needs to be a double devolution, if you like, in terms of Shetland's community, for no other reason than its remoteness and, if you like, its dependence on the Lifeline ferry service and the air services.
Do you know what's funny about this, James, is that you and I are sitting here, I'm sitting in mainland Scotland and you're sitting in the north of England, and we're like a pair of Sean Connerys in the south of Spain talking about independence for Scotland and Shetland and how super it would be. Neither of us live there.
Well, I don't have the money or play golf. Although my brother's a very, very keen golfer and a very good one too. But no, I don't have the resources, unfortunately. But I could certainly, I mean, me and my partner, Gillian, who's from Glasgow, we're quite keen to move back north of the border. And I don't know if that's just looking at life through rose-tinted glasses. I don't know if that would be Shetland. I'm not sure, Gillian, because of her family commitments, that would work for her. But we are certainly in the longer term hoping to move back north of the border. And I would like nothing better to the idea of either before or certainly after the concept of moving back to an independent Scotland, because I do think Scotland has the ability, a bit like I said about Shetland, there's enough talent and ability for Scotland to govern itself. It just still needs to overcome its apprehensions and fears about either falseness that's been said about the economy and everything, the fear, Project Fear, the same that's operated in England around Brexit.
I think we better wrap it up there, because otherwise we're going to get into a huge... No, not at all. But we're going to get into a huge potential extra political dimension, and I'm going to wrap it up partly because I've got another call at 10:30, which I'm now a wee bit late for, and partly because...
Yeah, sorry.
No, not at all. But we've done 30 minutes.
Can I just thank you? Can I just thank you, Thor, for this? It's been great, and also thanks to JJ Jimison, who put me in touch with you and Adam.
Brilliant.
I've enjoyed it.
Nice one. Well, thank you for coming on the Shetland Times podcast. It has been
Pleasure.
wonderful speaking to you, James. A really entertaining, great interview.
Well, we'll keep in touch.
Thanks for listening to the Shetland Times podcast today. I've been your host, Thor Holt. If you've got any feedback for us, please do go to theshetlandtimes.co.uk and get in touch via the website, or you can catch the Shetland Times on the Facebook page. And yeah, we'd love to hear your thoughts so far, who you'd like to hear us interview, and if you could spare 30 seconds to give us an iTunes review, that would be wonderful as well. Thanks. See you next time.